Good afternoon, everyone, or hello if you're joining this session online after the date of publication. My name's Ollie Bray, and I'm one of the strategic directors at Education Scotland. And I've been asked to talk a little bit today about the future of digital in Scottish education. And this is the first of what we hope will be a number of talks where we've got different people from across Scottish education that are coming together to give almost like a mini presentation or a mini keynote full of provocations and full of their own ideas based on their own experiences about the general direction that we're going on in Scottish education in terms of digital technology. So I'm going to be speaking to you probably for about the next 40 minutes. I hope that's okay. Just that you know, these are the sorts of things that I'm going to be talking about. So I'll start off by just sort of telling you a little bit about me, if I've not met you already. Then I'm going to move on a little bit to talk a little bit about what does the future hold. We're going to talk about shiny versus inappropriate things. We'll have a quick sort of name check on COVID. We can't not do that, can we? But we'll also reflect on what we learned from COVID and I think the important lessons from that and how we can move on from there. We'll think about the importance of technology in learning around that, not just technology for learning. We'll be thinking about building strong digital communities. We'll think about some practical pedagogies linked to that. I'll ask some important questions, I think, about the future Scotland digital landscape, and we'll need to consider about how we can all kind of get behind that. And then at the end, there'll be some time for some sort of final thoughts. And then I would invite you to either comment online via Twitter, or get in contact with me via email if you want to sort of challenge or carry on with the discussion. And also, as we go through the presentation, if there's anything that you would like to hear a little bit more of, I would also really invite that feedback on the end. So if you want to hear more about digital pedagogies, that's the sort of session that we could run. If you want to hear a little bit more about what's appropriate, learning from COVID, impact of COVID and digital technologies, again, we're really, really happy to put these together as a team. So as I said, I'll just start off with a little bit about me. I think this background is important here. I think it's important that you know that I trained as a geography teacher. I spent most of my early career working in East Lothian. I was a huge advocate just at the end of last century and in the first part of this century about the use of digital technologies in classrooms, and particularly geography classrooms, and what we could do that to sort of transform learning and transform the learning experience. I worked in East Lothian for nearly 10 years and was eventually a deputy head teacher in one of the biggest secondary schools there, but was also head of the geography department, head of social subjects department. I then moved up to Highland, where I was head teacher of Kingussie High School. For those of you that don't know, Kingussie High School is quite a small school. It's got about 420 pupils on the school roll, but it was also Scotland's first one-to-one Chromebook school, and it was the pilot project for the wider Highland Chromebook rollout, and I was heavily involved in that and some of the leadership around that as well. I'm passionate about colleges and the use of sort of further education. I was on the board for a number of years of Inverness College, UHI, and I'm really interested about how digital technologies can transcend the college school environment so that we can develop more opportunities for our students, but also how we can gain efficiencies in things like timetables. I had a small break in my career with Scottish Education in 2018, and I moved to Denmark and I worked for the Lego Foundation, where I was in charge of a number of different projects, but one of the projects was around the use of play and technology, where I had a great privilege to be working with organisations like the MIT Media Lab, the creators of the Scratch programming language, and I also managed the Lego Foundation's response to distance learning via its COVID response. And I've been back at Education Scotland since February 2021, where I've got strategic responsibility at the moment for the curriculum, the work that we do around digital learning and teaching, including GLOW, and currently our professional learning and leadership programs as well. So that includes things like the training of head teachers, but also our into headship programs, our systems leadership programs, and our middle leadership programs as well. So I think it's an interesting remit. It's certainly a busy remit, but delighted this afternoon to be talking a little bit about technology. And I suppose really what I'm hoping to do over the next sort of 40 minutes or so is just to sort of share a few things that are important. It's the first one of these sessions that we've run, and a few things that are on my mind when I think about technology in Scottish schools, or indeed technology in education in general. Now, it is a presentation, obviously, around the future of digital technology, and I thought it might just be interesting to think a little bit to start with about, what does the future hold, but also maybe to kind of reflect a little bit about where we've previously, in the past, thought about the future and where we've kind of got that drastically wrong. And I sometimes use these sort of three slides in other presentations that I do. This picture here actually came from a magazine from the USA. It was published in 1910. It was trying to imagine the future of schooling, sort of quite genuinely, around this. Of course, what's quite interesting, about this is that you've got all of your students there sat in rows, and they're plugged into the kind of the learning machine, and you can see I guess a rather stereotypical head teacher there, or principal or schoolmaster feeling books, feeding knowledge, into what looks like a wood chipper, and one of the pupils sort of turning that around to transfer the knowledge from the books, into the brains of these students. And again, that was from 1910. I mean, we can move forward to sort of 1963. Some of you remember the Flintstones, others of you remember the Jetsons, which is the cartoon where this comes from. And again, we can see here the idea of the robotics maths teacher, again speaking to the students at the front of the class, transmitting knowledge, and the idea of kind of robots, being in charge of different classrooms. And again, we've got other sort of technology companies that have come over at different times. This is a really interesting publication, if you can still sort of find it online, with some really interesting sort of diagrams within it as well. This comes from 1982, where Atari was predicting the future of schools. And of course, what you can see here is kind of heavily gamified learning, I suppose. And you can see that actually young people are, controlling their learning using, what a traditional Atari joystick would have looked like. So all of these things I think are interesting. I think the kind of history of education projections is interesting. I'm not saying that any of this is right or any of this is wrong, but I think probably what we can conclude from this is that actually we're a lot better about getting predictions about the future wrong rather than right, rather than correct, in the first place. And of course, there's nothing wrong with this in terms of what we do, as long as we learn from this, as long as we learn from the past and we're able to sort of try and take some of these ideas forward. But what I will say is I think that we're terrible in Scottish education. I think that quite often we're constantly reinventing the wheel. We're not reflecting on learning that we had 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. We're reinventing things, and we're not taking the way that we work and the way that we work in different ways forward. Now, I'm not saying for a moment that actually thinking about large technology drivers or future technology drivers aren't important. And again, I would think that, as this is a talk about the future of digital technologies in school, that we should all be aware, of some of these big technology drivers that are either here in some parts of society now, or increasingly encroaching on some parts of our school system. Things like 3D printing, things like access to big data through cloud computing, things like sensors on pretty much everything from buildings to on our persons via watches, phones, etc., the Internet of Things, that's sometimes called. This idea of constant connectivity in most parts of Scotland. I know that's a big problem that we have in some parts of Scotland. Connectivity is really an issue, but in most parts of Scotland, most places are connected, and indeed most young people after a certain age are connected via 4G and increasingly sort of 5G. We've got more robots than ever before, both in industry, but also in different things that we do around our homes. For example, robot vacuum cleaners, robot lawnmowers. So the interaction between us and physical machines on a more regular basis is only going to become more common. We've increasingly then got the universal, or instant translation. It's interesting, for example, that we could turn on the automatic translation function on this Teams call now, and I could be translated into a number of different languages: French, Ukrainian, Spanish, Russian. All these different types of languages could be created now because we've got this instant translation. Not 100% accurate, but boy, so much better than it was, even 2 or 3 years ago from that as well. We've got the kind of blurring of virtual and physical worlds through augmented reality and holograms and things like that, both again, on our phones and also on headset devices. And increasingly, we've got this kind of real-time conversation, with artificial intelligence chatbots. So I'm saying that all of these sort of technology drivers are important, but it's also really, really important that we don't kind of get seduced by them and start retrofitting them, into our schools. And I thought I would illustrate this sort of perfectly, if you like, with 2 recent articles that came on the BBC News. One is from the 21st of December 2021 about the metaverse, and one I just sort of screenshotted earlier, I think it was just last week, around a new AI chatbot that Google is launching there. And the reason I'm showing you this, folks, is because these are two different types of technologies that both appeared on that sort of first slide. But what I would say, in my opinion, is the whole idea of the metaverse and using that is unlikely to make it into education anytime soon. In fact, it's probably unlikely to make it into society at scale anytime soon. However, things like more realistic AI chatbots will be here before we know it. And we need to start thinking about now, what impact will these technologies have, on our classrooms, or the way that our young people interact with machines and, more importantly, information. So the point I'm trying to make here, folks, is that it's really, really easy to be seduced by shiny things, new shiny things that we can put into our classrooms, which then we try and retrofit into good learning environments. And we've got to sort of try and avoid that in as many ways as possible. And I like to kind of think a little bit or tell a bit of a story around this. So for me, it's not necessarily about the technology, but it's more about the appropriate tools. And I think a good kind of illustration on this, there's a mentor that once sort of showed this example to me, is that if I wanted to put a picture up, like this picture that was here, I probably would put the picture up using a hammer and nail around that, because that would be an appropriate tool for that job. Now, I live in the Scottish Highlands. I cut my own wood. I've got a chainsaw in the garage. I could use a chainsaw to put this picture up, but it's not it's an inappropriate tool to do it. It would still work, probably. It might kind of create a mess, but it's an inappropriate, over-engineered tool, for this particular job. And of course, for those of you that are looking sort of carefully on the slide, you'll hopefully maybe sort of see what I've done with a picture within there as well. It's thinking about actually what do we want children to learn, and therefore, what's the appropriate technology. So if we're wanting children to learn, for example, about how to identify a certain type of tree that's in the school grounds, then I might bring in some leaves, some physical leaves, to get people to kind of look at that. Or if I don't have these kind of physical leaves available, I just really want the young people to concentrate on the leaf and not have any other distraction. Actually, some pictures of leaves, either shown digitally or handed out digitally, printed out, would be an appropriate way to do that. Or if I wanted people to understand, what different places, look like, or sounded like, then actually going onto YouTube and finding a video, of a rainforest and showing the video with the screen turned off so people can just hear the audio might be a good way for young people to be able to zoom in on that. Or I could take it a stage further and I could show the audio, with the picture, or just the picture without the audio. Or if I was really wanting young people to get into a immersive 3D environment to find out what some of these kind of woodlands or rainforests look like around the world, then something like, a 3D headset might be appropriate. But of course, one of the problems that we have with technology is that people get seduced in and they go straight to the 3D headset, which most of the time might not be appropriate for the learning that we're trying to achieve. So again, one of the golden rules that I'm trying to put forward here is that we can't get seduced by the technology. All of these things are appropriate, as long as the learning is appropriate that fits around it. And the reason I suppose that we sometimes do this is that for a long time, in Scotland, and I've used a few historical images here, including some images of older computers and older iPads, is that we've really focused on the technology for learning. We've had different iterations of technologies in classrooms. In Scotland was, one of the first countries in the world, certainly the first country in the UK, to have a computer, a desktop computer, in every teacher's classroom, around that. It was one of the first, countries in the world in order to sort of pilot online learning systems and communities of practice for head teachers. We've got a long history, of technologies, in schools in Scotland, but quite often it's all been about the hardware rather than about the learning that goes with it, because it's not been associated with proper professional development. And I suppose when we think about that, the other thing that we're sort of guilty about, not just in Scottish education, but in society as a whole, is that we get a new bit of technology, but we don't think about how that technology allows us to do the same thing, but in different ways. I always think this is a really, really good example of this. It's the Cisco telepresence system, a very, very expensive video conferencing system. And of course, if you're having a video conference, compared to a traditional meeting, one of the things that you're able to remove is the time factor within it. If you go into a physical meeting and it's going to take you an hour to drive there, you don't want to just turn up for a 15-minute meeting. You want to make sure that your time has been worthwhile, as part of that. But what we quite often see when we think about video technology, often in schools and in business, is that meetings are still an hour long, but they don't need to be, because you haven't driven there to be able to do it. You can get most of your business done probably in 15 minutes and you can move on to the next thing. You can get some sort of time back. But we tend to enslave technologies to traditional practice, both in terms of efficiency, but also in terms of, classroom teaching. And I suppose we could take that a little bit further, because we saw a bit of that during COVID, didn't we? And this is not a criticism of the system's response to COVID, which was just absolutely magnificent. But if we think about kind of more traditional classroom teaching, and there's still a place for this, by the way, I'm not against what you might call traditional classroom teaching, where you've got a teacher as the expert and they are, giving information to children and young people, is that we saw a lot of that replicated, in our online learning environments during COVID. In fact, even schools that champion things like collaborative learning and cooperative learning and project-based learning, and some of these other methodologies, defaulted to what might be described as a more didactic approach during COVID because they weren't using the technology to its full advantage around it, or they were forgetting about some of those pedagogical principles which they could use, as part of COVID. So that's just some interesting things, I guess, for us to sort of think about, because I think it's about how do we pull out evidence-based practice and use the technology to help us with these things. So I've mentioned COVID and I said that I would. So I suppose this is a good point to sort of just try and reflect, a little bit on the last few years and think about how we start to move things forward. And I'm not going to sort of spend too long on this, but I do think it's important for us to kind of acknowledge it. Very, very simplified view of how I view things oftenly about where we are now, which is here today, in 2022 in October, and then that time that we had before March 2020. And of course, I suppose when I think about this and I think about the timeline, I'm not just really thinking about COVID. I'm thinking about all of the other big disruptors that we had and all the other big disruptors that have come about, during this time over the last 24 months or so. We've got COVID-19, which still continues around that. We've had the war in Ukraine. We've got the cost of living crisis. We've had all of these little things that have put these kind of lumps and bumps in the road in terms of schooling and what we can do in society. I suppose the interesting part of this is that every time there's been a change or every time there's been a lump and a bump in the road around that, then quite often what it's led to is it's led to this kind of little pocket of innovation. Sometimes this innovation hasn't been scaled. Sometimes this innovation has looked very, very differently depending on the community and society you're in. But we've seen some great innovations over the last 2 years, two and a half years. And I suppose the challenge for us to think about as educators and educators that are interested in technology, because I assume that's why you're here, that's why you're listening to this, is to think a little bit more about, well, what was working well before COVID, what worked well during COVID, and then how can we create and continue to build these new models and ways of learning, as we continue and as we start to get out of the pandemic and as we move into 2023, 2024, and beyond. And what I would hope, folks, I genuinely would hope around this is that all of these things, because there's a lot of things going on in Scottish education, but all of these things that are going on in Scottish education, the OECD review, the review of assessment and qualifications, the report from Kemure about putting learners at the centre, the national discussion which is currently going on, but all of these things, would help contribute and give a licence for a new and improved way of working. And that word improvement, I think, is really, really important. So when I think about different innovations and during COVID, sometimes I chat to people and they kind of say, well, actually, during COVID, there was lots of innovations in digital learning. And there was to a point. But actually, a lot of the learning that came from that wasn't that innovative. It was just necessary, like in many ways. And it certainly wasn't consistent, across the whole country. Again, that's not a criticism of it, but it certainly wasn't necessarily innovative. What it did do, of course, is it provided a massive upskilling, for teachers across the country. And it also, provided a realization to many, many children in Scotland that actually they could learn in a different way. Yeah, and in fact, some of them wanted to learn more independently and they wanted to learn in their own way, in their own pace online. And of course, COVID affected children in many different ways. A lot of that was negative, but some of that, was quite positive as well. But when I think about innovation, when I think about COVID, it's not just about the digital learning, is I think about all of the other things that happened, particularly during those kind of early days of COVID. There were innovations, I think, in collaboration. There were innovations in community. There were innovations in partnership. There were innovations in the pace that we could do things. And again, we seem to have got back to a sort of slow pace of change. There were innovations in the agility that we could scale things up or scale things down or to try new things. And there were certainly innovations in the way that we joined up services. So while there was innovation in digital learning, there was also innovation in all of these things. But a lot of that, was enabled by technology. And we need to sort of keep working on that. And we need to keep developing that, I think, as we go forward, as we move out of here. We did learn a lot about digital learning and teaching during COVID. And I think it's worth sort of flagging that up here around that. We learned, for example, and children tell us this, young people tell us this, that social interaction was very important. In your own schools, there'll be some young people that were desperate to get back to school. And these are young people that might not have been school's biggest fan before COVID around. You'll have seen that in your own classrooms. Supporting well-being, we learn is incredibly complicated online, around that in terms of health and well-being check-ins, making sure that people are okay. We know that practical skills, quite often practical skills requiring specialist equipment were very, very hard to do. Work experience was also practically non-existent around that. But if you needed a craft room or art and design materials, these were more tricky things to kind of do online. Confidence in digital tools sometimes restricted pedagogical approach. I've already touched on this earlier. We didn't see a huge amount around collaborative learning, or sometimes feedback, written versus video, were struggling. People struggle with handing an assignment. So thinking around different pedagogical approaches and how these all work. Most young people were desperate to get back to school. Some young people now might be desperate not to get back to school, but at the time they were desperate to sort of try and get back. And as I've already mentioned, already lockdown impacted many different children in many different ways. Some of this was unexpected for the negative, and some of this was unexpected for the positive. We also, of course, sort of during this time, learned a lot about presence. And by presence, I mean, physical presence and digital presence. We learn, I think, as classroom teachers and as facilitators of learning, is that if all of a class is physically present, something that we're used to, we're used to it, we can do it, we can still probably improve it, we can always improve, right? But we could do it and we can sort of do it quite well. If all the class is digitally present, we learned during COVID that we can do it. We've still got a lot to learn, but we could still do it and we could still continue to improve. We learned that if sometimes the class was physically present all the time and then all the class was digitally present, we can work with that because we're okay at the first two things. We can sort of make that with that kind of like more blended approach. You're all here and then you're all online. You're all here, you're all online. That seemed to work. But we also learned that actually if some of the class was online and if some of the class was physically present, and that was really hard. And let's not stop pretending that it was an easy thing to do. That's a really, really hard thing to do if you've got some of your class physically in the room and some of them, are joining online. We're not used to that. That's doing things in different ways. And when I say, folks, about learning from COVID, when I think about this, I think this expands all of the way to things like school estate. So how are we thinking in advance about adapting our school estates, particularly as we're building new schools, so that they're better and they're more conducive to things like hybrid learning? And of course, schools, and the school system is really, really good at inventing the wheel. However, the college system is incredibly good at this. And we've only got to look at the college system, and we've got some great colleges and some universities in Scotland to think about how they're actually dealing with, and managing like online and hybrid learning. And again, I won't go into this in sort of detail about this kind of room here, which is sort of geared up for hybrid learning, but just to kind of explain as I go the left to the sort of the right of the diagram here, is I've got a kind of teacher lectern. So a teacher can sort of move around the room. It's on notes. It can go around. They can put a laptop on there if they want to. They can put other things on there if they want to. It's highly sort of flexible around that. At the top of the screen that we've got there, we've got a hearing loop, so it makes everything really, really accessible. It's high-speed Wi-Fi also in this room. You can see as I move around to sort of the middle of the screen there, so I've got a high-definition video camera, which can move around and it can capture different parts of the room. It's also wide angle, around that as well. Underneath that, I've got the main display area that people will be looking at, and obviously you can sort of view online exactly the same way as you're viewing this online here as well. Moving to the bottom right, I've got a different sort of screen now on there, and the importance of that screen is because that shows the pictures of the people that are joining online, so that the people that are sat around the physical tables can see their online classmates. Right? So again, you've still got that kind of social interaction around that. You can still sort of make that eye contact. There's that feeling of connectedness. There's that feeling of belonging around that as well. And then up in the ceiling here, we've got a microphone that's going down, so we can pick up sound from anywhere in the room, so anybody can contribute. And we've also really got in there as well. We've got really, really good, speakers to be able to translate that as well. So actually, the college system is really, really good at this. But let's start thinking about how have we learned from COVID, and how do we start to build schools a little bit from this? So moving on, moving away from sort of COVID now, we've reflected a little bit on technology for learning, and that is really, really important. And I think probably what sometimes people don't understand is that you really need some sort of technology for learning, before you can start thinking about technology in learning. Now, I think that the technology in learning is the important bit, but of course, in order to have this, you need some sort of hardware, or some sort of software. Now, there are many different ways that we can kind of classify, technology, in learning and how it works, and there's lots and lots of different conceptual sort of frameworks out there. I think about it in sort of quite a simple way, really, is that I think that there's ways that we kind of use technology, and I'm thinking more here about using technology for kind of productivity. These would tend to be our kind of big productivity suites like Office 365 or Google Workspace. I think there's opportunities then to kind of create with technology, where we're actually sort of trying to get young people to be the creators, not the consumers of digital content. This includes things like Scratch, which I've already mentioned, block-based coding system, Minecraft, UDK, so creative tools for actually young people to be able to create things as part of it. No, this is exclusive, by the way. There's lots of different things we've got there. And then I think the other important one, which is sometimes overlooked, is actually how do we use different digital tools in a creative way in order to engage our classes, but also to meet, importantly, those learning outcomes. So it's not just about using a digital tool for digital tool's sake, but how am I using that to improve literacy, to improve numeracy, to improve an understanding of scientific concepts or an understanding of place in society? How am I using these tools to sort of try and make them work? And I suppose when I think about technology in learning, and I'm thinking about impact to learning, then we need to sort of go back to sort of learning theory. Now, we know lots and lots about learning. There's still lots and lots of different agreements about learning. But the one thing that pretty much everybody, will tell you is that if you're wanting to improve one thing in classrooms, then it's really, really good to sort of focus on feedback. And there's lots of research on this. Dylan Williams, John Hattie, to name, but a few, really, really prominent academics in this field thinking about, feedback, and feedback is important, and it's important to teachers from learners, to teachers from peers, from learners to learners, and from teachers to learners as well. Feedback is important, across the whole system around that. So when I talk to people about the use of digital technology in schools and driving improvement forward, one of the important places to start, I think, is not about technology for engagement purposes, but technology to improve feedback. So what technology tools can we use to improve feedback? It's more evidence-led that way. And I'm not going to give lots of examples of this, but remember at the start of the talk, I was saying that if people would like to hear more about how some of these tools could be used, we'd be very happy to do that. But this is just a quick example from a school that I was in, sort of quite recently around that. They're using, it's a modern languages classroom around that. I quite like the picture because there's a combination there of like stuff that kids are writing on. I've got a dictionary, in there as well. We've got Chromebooks. It's a one-to-one, environment. They're using the online Duolingo app around that. And the young people have done a quick quiz, around that. And that's given the teachers some interesting sort of feedback straight away. So they can quickly look, at the end of that sort of quiz, at the end of that sort of mini quick test around that, and they can see that, and the yellow line sort of shows it there, that there seem to be a number of people in the class that are struggling with that question around that. Could be for a number of reasons. It could be the way they've asked the question. That could be people that have been in the football team and they missed that lesson, as part of it. But there seems to be some sort of problem, as a result of that, down there for a number of people in the class. And then, I guess, we can sort of look horizontally around that as well. And we can see a number of learners there that have struggled with more than one or two different questions as well. So perhaps they're struggling a little bit, with some of the concepts that are coming from this class as well. And the reason that I think this is important, folks, is that this isn't just about using technology to measure where young people are and saying that you've got 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10 and reporting on that. It's not a reporting mechanism. This is using technology powerfully to support what I would describe as another really, really good Dylan Williams quote, is that we're using the data to actually critically ask ourselves, well, how then can I make the learning better? Why are the young people not understanding these concepts? Why have a number of young people not understood the one concept? How can I meet my teaching better? How can I get that feedback? And how can I improve myself to help young people, meet that sort of learning outcome? So again, really, really different ways to think about sort of using technology for feedback, I think, but feedback is so important. The other question that we kind of have to ask ourselves is, of course, is like, how do we want, young people to learn? And so far we focused quite a lot on digital technologies, really. But again, I'd like to sort of expand the definition, because for me, I'm a big fan of young people learning through projects. Not all the time around that. I get really frustrated when people think there's a bipolar argument between you must learn in a project-based way or you must learn, in a way that's sort of fairly didactic. There's an absolute place for both around that, and indeed, young people deserve to have both around that to get a really rounded skill set, I think. But there are some technologies that I think that are more suited, for sort of project-based learning. Things like system-based robotics, things like creative coding using Scratch and other applications, or things using sort of low-end technologies that aren't digital in nature, but include things like motors and batteries and other creative materials to come together. So this idea of robotics, making and tinkering and creative coding, I think are really, really important for project-based approaches. And again, they're a good example of technology. It might not be a digital technology, all of the time, but a really good example of technology. And why I think, of course, that learning in this way is important for young people some of the time is it helps include and develop a whole range of holistic skills. And I think using technologies like systems-based robotics and creative coding and making and tinkering where young people are actually kind of getting hands-on around that, it helps develop things in particular like creativity. And this is a kind of creative learning spiral here that comes out of the MIT Media Lab, is that a lot of these project-based approaches using the technologies that I've described are open-ended in nature, and they allow young people to imagine, the solution to a problem, to create something, to play with it, to mess around with it, to try and break it, to share it with others, to get feedback, to reflect on their feedback they've had, to reimagine it, to rebuild it, to recreate it, to play around with it, to share it with others, to get some feedback, an adult member of the class, to reflect on that feedback, to rebuild it, to remake it, and to continue sort of moving forwards, from there. A really kind of powerful way of learning, an important way to develop creativity, in young people. And of course, it's not about creativity or just about creativity. There's a whole range of skills that we think are important for young people to have within Scotland. We're not always, definitive, I think, about some of these skills and how they work, but it's also really, really important to think about this skills framework that we've got here, the meta skills framework from Skills Development Scotland, and think about how do we develop these skills with and without technology. So I've talked a little bit about creativity there. If you want to develop creativity in young people, yet they have to create things. These could be digital things, or these could be analog things, or they could be a combination of both. I think that's where it gets really, really powerful. But also let's maybe sort of think about, communicating and collaborating. Now, we can think about what that might look like in a classroom environment without technology, where young people are talking and listening, or collaborating, where young people are engaged in group work around the table. But actually, what does that look like, in a situation or in a workplace which is flooded with technology, where everybody's got a computer on their desk, like they have got in the workplace, at the moment, or in one-to-one environments. And it's interesting to sort of see some schools starting to play with this a little bit more now. So the picture that you can kind of see on the left here, you can see young people that are sat around the table. They're in a science classroom, I think. They're all, you would think, working in groups around it. They are doing a group work exercise. But the interesting thing about this picture is that in each of the tables, you've got one person from each of the different groups. So the people that are sat on the same table aren't in the same group as each other. So what the school's trying to do here is it's using digital technology to develop ways around digital collaboration, around that. Now, obviously, they would do normal collaboration as well, but they're trying to get young people to develop this sort of skill set that you might have to use in the workplace, where you're working with, young people digitally. There's another example up here. It's a S1 example here. It's a group of young people. They're preparing for a science test around that, but they're swapping revision questions with the class next door that are also providing that. So they're doing a worthwhile learning activity, in the opinion of the teacher, but they're also developing their digital technology and digital collaboration skills as well. And I'd like to see more of that, in Scotland. It's not just about, some of these kind of more creative ideas, though, ideas that are starting to gain traction around that. It's really, really important that in anything that we do in Scotland, that we get the basics right, around these things. I think this is just so important as we move forward from here. Things like internet search is just so important. It's just something that young people, in my opinion, are terrible at. And they're terrible at it is because we're terrible at teaching them about it. We need to get better at that. Thinking about different sources of information, thinking about what's reliable, what's not reliable, helping young people navigate, the vastness of sort of cyberspace to find the information and the skills and the knowledge and the opportunities that they actually require. And we need to sort of help them and handhold them with that. It's such a basic skill, but one that we constantly get wrong, and something we need to sort of double down to, rather than some of the bigger, more more seductive ideas that I was talking about at the start of the talk. And again, I'm not going to go into detail around this as well, but also thinking about technology and how that improves access, and how it improves accessibility, for some people. I think we're very, very lucky in Scotland to have organisations like Cool Scotland that specialise, in this. And again, if folks on this call are looking for some more information about accessibility features of digital technology, that's something that we would be happy, to help provide or do a session on, probably with the likes of Cool Scotland. And I suppose other questions that are on my mind at the moment is how do we, develop the skills of young people and prepare them for structured online learning? Because, I think one of the things that I've acknowledged over the last decade or so is that if we're really serious about developing young people to be lifelong learners, as soon as they leave that school environment, then actually most of the learning that they will do will be online. In fact, even if you go to many university courses now, a lot of the learning is still done online. Physical lectures, are still there, but actually they're coming down in terms of the amount that it would be. You might have sort of workshops and tutorials, but there'd be a lot of online learning with that. So if we're serious about developing successful learners and lifelong learners, how do we develop young people and prepare them for structured online learning? Because that's hard. A young person can go onto YouTube and it can find a clip of something they're interested in at that time, but they're motivated to do that in a different way. To do a piece of hard learning in a structured way over a period of weeks or months is a difficult thing to do, and we need to kind of condition and prepare, young people to be able to do that. And for those of you that know me well, you would expect me to kind of say that I think that some of the answers to this is around building strong digital communities. And I think that some of the answers to this is within the curriculum. And I think that we've got a pretty good curriculum framework in Scotland. I'm pleased that it's under review. I'm pleased that we're under reform at the moment. But I think actually we've got the building blocks of something sort of quite special. And it's got the flexibility within it for people to develop things in special ways. But we don't always exploit, the flexibility of the curriculum. And let me just sort of show you a little bit about what I mean by this in terms of building strong digital communities and the things that this curriculum gives permission for, but we don't always do. So if you just bear with me a minute and just sort of look at the diagram here, is that this is a kind of typical journey, of a young person through school. So they start off in the early years and they go to level 1, like level 2. So I've not obviously gone all the way down to primary 1 in the early years here. I'm starting at primary 5, but I'm acknowledging that. I'm not saying that doesn't exist. I'm not saying that digital technology doesn't start from primary 5. Of course, it goes all the way down. It's just the purpose of this diagram. So we've got that broad general education stage for the whole of the primary phase, going up to the end of S3, and then we've got the kind of senior phase, like on top of that. Of course, the interesting thing is that it doesn't quite work in this sort of linear way, because in many places in Scotland, not all, but many, you've actually, of course, got a number of different sort of feeder primary schools that will eventually funnel into one secondary school, around that. And it's interesting because I think one of the great benefits of Scottish education is that unless you move house, once you enter, your primary school, you can pretty much know which secondary school that you're going to go to. It's not always the case, but in most cases, that's the case. But we don't always capitalise the power of that associated school group model around that. Just have a little think about, some of the things that we could do, linked to sort of some of the things that I said that the curriculum allows for and that we've got permission to do, right? But not all schools do it, and there are a variety of different reasons for that. Well, it might be, for example, that there's an aspiration from the school's leadership team that in the senior phase, everybody has the opportunity, I'm not saying this is compulsory, but everybody has the opportunity to take an online certificated course around that. And that's useful because it allows you to broaden your sort of senior phase curriculum, but also it helps develop that lifelong learning agenda. And I could give a real practical example of that when I was head teacher at Kingussie High School. When I was head teacher at Kingussie High School, we ran French at National 5, and other levels obviously as well, higher at National 5, advanced higher French, and we ran Spanish at National 5, but we didn't have the capacity within our staffing team to offer higher Spanish. But we had a number of young people, as we started to offer National 5 Spanish, that wanted to do it. Didn't have the budget to recruit a Spanish teacher. So our pupils from Kingussie High School, 5 or 6 pupils a year, used to engage in online learning with Edinburgh College, a number of miles away, and they would engage in the online process, the online learning course, and many of them went on to do very, very well, and many of them then went on to use languages in life, in the hospitality industry in the Scottish Highlands, or to go on and study them at college, or university. So it is possible, and some schools are doing some of these things. And what a message that sends for sort of lifelong learning. It might be that you see that in the broad general education of the secondary school, that many schools now start to offer electives within it, to offer a bit more sort of personalisation and choice. And it might be that perhaps taking part in an online course via a third-party provider becomes part of that elective. It might be that young people, for example, choose to opt into courses from FutureLearn, from the Open University, or edX, or Coursera, to actually sort of take part in these different courses as well. And again, it's developing those online skills and promoting that lifelong learning agenda and helping young people pursue some of their images, some of their own interests and develop their own skills. It might be interesting as we go down to the associated school group model, and we've learned that this is possible because of COVID, although many people aren't doing it now, is that, for example, that once a week, the primary 6 young people come together because they're working in a one-to-one enabled laptop environment, and they work across the cluster in different interest groups or in different levels. It doesn't really matter. But maybe then they're developing a similar skill set, or similar aspects of knowledge that then eventually they'll take with them up into primary 7, and beyond, so that we can get progressions in learning going that way as well. So it's just some interesting ideas and to explore here. And again, we know that some schools, are doing this, and they're really starting to embrace in that kind of whole associated school group model, not just for pastoral care, but also for kind of learning as well around that. We also know, of course, that actually probably we're about to kind of see, and I feel this, that we're about to get a bit more of a resurgence of creative technology approaches. And what I mean by this is that probably for a number of years now, in some parts of Scotland, we've focused quite a lot on the productivity tools. 10 or 15 years ago, there was a lot of work going on around podcasting and digital video, and that seems to have dipped, for a little while. And we've been focusing more on these kind of productivity tools around that. Things like the ability to do a spreadsheet or a PowerPoint presentation, or to format something in Word. Now, all these things are worthy in nature, but don't necessarily, develop kind of the creative approaches to using ICT. And what I think what we'll sort of start to see with this now is I think that we'll start to see schools investing again in moving image education, in sound, in podcasting, in digital images, in animation, in writing for the web via blogs and micro blogs, robotics I've already mentioned again, playful approaches such as games design, and of course thinking about different ways to manipulate data, presentations, portfolio, etc. And the reason that I think this is important, folks, is because what we see again in some parts of Scotland is we see that actually that these ideas around kind of creative approaches are embedded in the curriculum, and that across the associated school group, people are talking to each other so that they know that as young people transition from primary 7 to S1, then most of those young people will be able to edit a video well, because we know there's lots of young people that edit videos badly, or to take a digital photograph well, or to edit a podcast well, or to be able to do a simple Scratch programming language well. Around, they've built up this basic skill level in terms of these creative approaches as they transition, through the primary school, right, then into the secondary school. We also see in the secondary school, where perhaps we've not got that kind of robust associated school environment, that sometimes creative technology approaches are given to certain departments. So, for example, it might make sense that an English department in a school specialises in writing for the web, and young people in S1 and S2, they develop their writing for the web skills around blogs and wikis and microblogs. It might be that the modern languages department, specialises in animation, because using animation has been seen to be a really, really good way to help talk about modern languages and develop modern languages skills around that. But also the animation skills can be transferred to other parts of the curriculum. And again, this is embedded in S1 and S2 in all of these different areas. And the reason this is important, of course, is that because it means that when the young people get to S3, or whenever they've learnt these skills around that, we can then start to be more creative in terms of approaches to assessment. We can start to say that we're not just looking for a written assessment here around that. We're looking for a video, or a podcast or a Scratch animation around that. But when we're not grading or marking or giving comment on the medium that you're using, we're giving comment on how you are able to express and relay and prove that if you learnt the learning, from there as well. So different creative approaches to assessment as an important part of the process. So I've talked a little bit about curriculum, and I've talked a little bit about assessment around that and how these could all be linked together. And again, for those of you who know me well, is that I think that you can't, separate pedagogy from that as well. And I'm not going to go into details about lots of different types of pedagogy, but a quick shout out for this book here, Practical Pedagogy by Professor Mike Sharples, former professor at the Open University, who's written the book, 40 New Ways to Teach and Learn, all evidence-based around that, talks about learning methodology with and without technology, which is the important part. So each of the 40 ways that he describes here is done without technology, but also how technology can augment and add to that. And I think this is an important piece in terms of the field of technology in education. And thinking a little bit about practical pedagogies and kind of how they work. And actually, in the introduction to kind of Mike's book here, He's got a really interesting quote, I think, from Thomas Edison. And this quote comes back from 1913, and it's a quote that was published in the New York Daily Mirror at the time, around that, where Edison says, again, talk about getting things wrong from the past, books, declared the inventor, that's Edison, with discussion, will soon be obsolete in public schools. Remember, this is from 1913. Scholars will be instructed through the eye. It will be possible to teach every branch of human knowledge with the motion picture. Our school system will be completely changed inside over 10 years. Remember, 1913, did that actually happen? Now, you'll notice, of course, that I highlighted that bit there, through the eye. Now, that's important. Edison goes on around that. We've been working for some time on school pictures. We've been studying and reproducing the life of the fly, a mosquito, a silk weaving moth, a brown moth, a gypsy moth, you obviously like moths, butterflies and various other insects. It proves conclusively the worth of motion pictures in chemistry, physics and other branches of study, making the scientific truth difficult to understand from textbooks, plain and clear for children to understand. Now, the interesting thing about this, folks, and the reason that I'm sort of saying this, is that Edison was completely wrong about the technology. We know that because there's still a place of books, in class. And of course, motion picture and video didn't catch on, in schools until really, quite modern times around that. But of course, the bit that he was right about is that although he got the technology wrong, he got the pedagogy right. That bit about through the eye. And in fact, animations and short animations and using little clips, and whether it's better to have cartoon characters or physical characters or Lego models, is still a great debate when it comes to research and helping young people learn, some of these tricky concepts. And again, learning through animations is one of the things that's mentioned here, in my book. And I'm not going to go over all of the kind of 40 pedagogies, but if you're interested in learning through technology, this really is kind of worth a read. Separates them into different groups. So pedagogy is to help personalization, pedagogy is to help connectivity, pedagogy is to help reflection, pedagogy is to help extension work, pedagogy is to help embodiment, and pedagogy is at scale, around that. And all these things I think are worth looking at, and we'd like to sort of see more people sort of playing with some of these concepts, I think, in Scottish schools. Now, I mentioned before this book is evidence-based, and actually the book is based on a series of what's called innovative pedagogy reports. The last one was published in 2021. There's not been a 2022 one yet, but they've been published since 2012. And if you don't want to buy the book, you can still go online. All of the innovative pedagogy reports, if you Google innovative pedagogy Open University, you'll find these reports that talks about different pedagogies and how they're having an impact in classroom, what the evidence basis for it, what the effect size for it is, and how they're augmented, with and without technology around that. So again, something to explore there about pedagogies, I guess, within the schools. And a question for us to ask ourselves is around, what's the combination of pedagogy that I need to teach my subject? Or I could remove that word subject, and what's the combination of pedagogy that I need to teach the learning concept that the children are interested in, or the objective that I've got for that today, and how do I support that, with and without technology? And I think one of the exciting things in terms of curriculum reform, in Scotland, is that we've got an opportunity now to develop different types of curriculum experiences. We've got an overcrowded curriculum in many ways. I hope that we're able to strip some of the things out, but I also hope that we'll be able to get digital technologies to, more forcefully transcend, some of the different areas. So if we're interested in getting more young people, for example, into coding and computer science, that can no longer just be the domain of a computer science classroom. How do we do that in other areas of the curriculum? We can start to develop some of these basic skills to do with physical computing, create block-based coding languages in things like geography, or science. And we can start to do that now at scale because the technology, is cheaper, and it allows us to be able to do that and it become easier to be able to use. And because we've got these kind of online tutorials, which means that young people can be self-directed where they need to be, as well. They're not always reliant on the teacher, normally just for support and not always just for the technical knowledge. We've also got a whole range of new different types of qualifications, which I think can kind of help in this space as well. We launched these qualifications just recently, a partnership between Microsoft, a number of colleges in Scotland, Education in Scotland. You're looking at industry-based qualifications. These are SEQF level 6, thinking about artificial intelligence, thinking about digital business decision-making around that. So again, we've got new qualifications that young people can subscribe to and learn from, and the resources are available online, and they're available for self-study as well as being supported, with a teacher. But I suppose, folks, and I'll sort of start to sum up in a minute here, just going to rattle through two things quickly, is that in order for us to be able to do all of these sorts of things, in order to be able to unlock all of these sorts of things, is that we have got some big challenges ahead. And the first thing that I want to acknowledge is that we've always got challenges with time and pace. We've quite often got challenges in our local communities, immediate challenges with families, and with young people that we need to work with and often help. And we've got challenges, in other areas where we're given goals, some of them necessary and some of them not necessarily, around attainment and other things. We're in this kind of, I guess, this domain of competing priorities, between the curriculum, between families and supporting families, and with not enough time to be able to do it in. But we do need to sort of think a little bit, I think, if we are going to move forward successfully as a nation around our digital landscape and how do we take that forward. And this is quite important, and this is where we're looking for probably a bit of buy-in for the people on this call, because I think that if we're really wanting to use digital technologies in Scottish schools, then we probably need a number of things. And again, there's lots of different models that describe this. I think about them really as these sort of 6 things here. Is we need connectivity, we need access via that connectivity, hotspots, for example, in schools. Young people then need devices to be able to access the connectivity. Then if you've got devices, it's no good unless you've got tools within that, around that. Young people probably then going to need some content. Gosh, we're terrible in Scotland about reinventing content all the time. Now, we want to have agency to be able to create our own content, but actually, some sort of nationally procured content for some things is probably a good idea. And then, of course, we need both young people and the people that they're working with, e.g. the teachers and the practitioners, to have a degree of digital skills, as well. And the reason this is important, folks, is because actually, I think that there is a time now where we're really, as they have done in some countries like Singapore and Wales, where we're starting to develop standards around these different things. So what's the standard for connectivity in all Scottish schools, and the standard for the tools and the types of tools that young people have access to, and the skills threshold around that, and what is the idea around sort of national content that young people will be able to access at home and at school? What's the sort of national standard for how do we develop an opinion on that? And what's interesting, of course, is at the moment we're split up into 32 local education authorities, which is fine. I'm not arguing with that, but you go to one local education authority and there might be not an investment in connectivity, but the school's full of Wi-Fi access points. But actually then the school doesn't invest in devices because there's not the connectivity to sort of try and make that work. And there might be some tools that are available via Glow or other national sort of services, and some content via the national e-learning offer. But teachers don't upskill because there's not enough devices, and the people that have got devices are frustrated because there's not the connectivity to be able to use it. And then you go to another local authority, a neighbouring local authority, and actually, you've got a group of teachers there that are really empowered, and they've upskilled around that. Like during COVID, perhaps they had a professional learning program that were on, and the kids have got access to content and tools via Glow and the National Digital Learning Strategy, but there's been no investment for whatever reason. This isn't an attack on local authorities, but there's been no investment on connectivity, access and devices over a period of time because there's been no money around that, and therefore, actually, the learners in this area are getting a different experience to learners, in another area. And then they go to another place somewhere else in Scotland, then you've got connectivity which is low, and you've got access and devices that are low, but again you've got the same problem because everybody's logging on at the same time. You can't actually get any of these things working. And of course, my point with this, folks, is that we need to try and get to a situation where we level up. That word's got different connotations at the moment, kind of politically, but we level up across Scotland so that every young person has got access to good connectivity, a device that they can access where appropriate to be able to access their learning, a good range of core set of digital tools within that, content where appropriate to stop people reinventing the wheel to save a bit of time, and that are constantly upskilled with some of these like emerging challenges. And it's important for us to think about this because, of course, where some places are more advanced than others, if we think about funding and making that work, we maybe need to make some decisions about where does the funding go in and how do we make that work, which means people have got to agree that things that we do are in the best interests of the young people of Scotland, around that, not just personal interests. This is, of course, then about joining things up and joining things together. And again, just to give a few examples here about the sorts of things that I think that we probably should be thinking about, is that we've mentioned we've got these challenges around connectivity. There's a Scottish Government project at the moment looking at devices and connectivity. Education in Scotland on the kind of periphery of that. We've got Glow, National Digital Internet. We're looking at the future of Glow at the moment and what happens next with the Glow platform. And of course, one of the things might be nothing happens at all. We don't know yet. We're just at the early kind of stages of this. But I think in terms of the join up, what we really need to do is we need to sort of try and get these points to converge. We need to sort of think about how are we joining up these big technology initiatives together at the national level, but also importantly at local authority and school level. And of course, when I think about these things, I think about GLOW and I think about digital connectivity. I'm also thinking a little bit about other things as well. We've got a national e-learning offer. We've got DigiLearn Scott that are facilitating this session this evening. It runs teacher professional development as much as other things, like our big National Learning Week, Cyber Resilience Week, for example, Digital Literacy Week around that. How are we getting all of these streams of work at some point to converge at some point between now, into the future, so they're all magnifying each other other bits of work. We've got other bits that potentially we could put in here as well. We've got a manifesto commitment for a National Digital Academy. How does that feed in? Can't develop that in isolation. We know that one of the biggest frustrations in schools, particularly secondary schools, is seamless registration. But that contains a lot of data. How are we pulling all of this together, around that and making these systems better for us so they're driving efficiencies rather than causing frustrations? And then we've got other things in here like the restructure of agencies that are going up, including my own. And again, some of the things coming out of the national conversation and the Ken Muir report and the OECD report. How are we getting all of these things to feed together to make something which is really, really strong, and something that's joined up and something that's powerful? And I do believe that we're in a really, really important time, in history where we could do that as long as we're talking together, and working together around that. And that's everybody at all levels of the system, from classroom teachers, head teachers, local authority staff, but most importantly, at that national level, for people that are managing these big infrastructure projects, making sure that everything is working together to get to one end goal, which is to improve the experiences, for young people. So I'm going to stop there. These are the things that I said we'll talk about at the start. We talked a little bit about the future, the difference between shiny and appropriate things, what we learned from COVID, technology in learning, technology for learning, building strong digital communities, those practical pedagogies, including a reference to sort of Mike's book in there, our digital landscape, and we'll move on to that sort of stage in a minute around thoughts, questions, challenges and discussions. And I suppose to sort of kickstart that is that we're doing a lot of thinking at the moment around some of the things that we've got a bit of control over in Education in Scotland in terms of other offers that might become part of the DigiLearn Scotland offer. This is one example of it, something that we're just trying and experimenting with, a new sort of format of doing things. And we're also starting to think a little bit about the future of GLOW and how that works. And again, we'll be interested in anybody's sorts of thoughts on that, and hope that you can be involved in those discussions as they participate. And I suppose my sort of final thoughts before summing up there is that there's a lot of stuff going on at the moment, including all these different national consultations and different bits, but everything's got to be in balance around that. And it's really, really important, as I've said many times before, that we get that balance right between what's important for the kids, and what's important for their learning, and making sure at the same time that if we're in classrooms or if we're running schools, that we're not exhausting ourselves, in the process. We've got to make some time for ourselves as well. So in final summary, and the sort of key messages of what I've sort of tried to cover today is that there's we're a lot better at getting the predictions about the future wrong than right. Don't let the shiny new technologies be a distraction. That's one of the things that I would want for the future of Scottish education, not for the shiny things to be a distraction. Technology for learning is important, but it's got to be appropriate. Think about new tools, old tricks, how are we doing things in different ways. I use the example of video conference. So again, my idea for the future of Scottish education is let's get better at that. Let's make sure that we're working in different, more efficient ways. COVID's changed everything, but we need to progress, not to regress. Let's think about what worked well. Let's keep hold of that, and let's keep building on that. As we move forward, I'd like to see some of these learnings from COVID coming out. That could be reflected in school design. It could also be reflected in classroom practice. I think that both formal and informal digital and hybrid learning is here to stay. Let's not miss the opportunity. For example, building design again, to help make things easier for practitioners and learners. That's how I'd like to see in the future. Technology in learning needs technology for learning, but let's start with the learning first around that. That's the most important thing. What do young people want to know? How does technology help with that? How do you want young people to learn? How does technology help for that? Where are we trying to get to? How are we improving maths, numeracy, science, geography, that concept of space? How we use technology to improve accessibility, inclusion and well-being. 3 really, really important things. It's not just about the shiny products around it. Curriculum design, I think it's absolutely key to building these strong digital communities. Let's think about working more in associated school groups. Digital technology allows us to do that. Let's think about these key creativity skills as young people progress through their learning journey, so that they're developing these skills as they go, because that allows more creative approaches to assessment, and it allows you to do more in different classrooms rather than constantly reinventing. it's time to revisit that creative use of technology, as I said before, animation, podcasting, robotics, and not just technology for productivity, easy documents and presentations. There's lots of evidence that supports practical pedagogy with and without technology. Read it. Let's make sure that everything's evidence-based. And we all have got a part to play, in considering Scotland's digital landscape. And very finally, as I said right at the end, everything needs to be in balance, and nobody needs an exhausted you, because that's not good for you, it's not good for your family, and it's not very good for the kids that are in front of you as well. So that's all I wanted to say. That's a few thoughts around the future of digital education in Scotland. Feel free to challenge anything that I've said. You can drop me an email. My email address is there. My Twitter handle is there if you want to sort of come in there. But again, it would be really useful to get some sort of feedback on any of these thoughts, but also importantly, any feedback of what you would like to hear or who you would like to hear from in some of these future sessions, particularly if you want us to deep dive into any of the things that I've quickly covered today. If you're watching live, I hope you have a great evening. And if you're joining us online, I hope you enjoyed the talk and we can connect again soon. Thanks very much.